And good afternoon. You're listening to Ken Hudnall. This is the Ken Hudnall Show. Coming to you from our studios right here in exciting El Paso, Texas. Gateway to the Old West and the most haunted city in the country. Well, today is March the 27th, the 88th day of this new year. The 86th day of this new year. Just 279 days remain till the year's over with, and we'll start a new one. Holidays and observances. Well, this is World Theater Day. Magical places where stories come to life. Stage is a portal to other worlds, transporting audiences by the power of live performances. International Scribble Day and Wear a Hat Day. Now let's see what stories we have in the news on this Friday morning. Well, the Senate passed an overnight bill that actually had to work to fund most of Homeland Security as the fight nears an end. DHS shutdown breakthrough came at a cost for Republicans as funding fights near their end. Congress is one step closer to ending the Homeland Security shutdown after the Senate advanced a new last-minute deal. But it came at a price of Republicans ceding ground temporarily to Senate Minority Leader Chuck, I'm going to shut you down, Schumer. Senate unanimously advanced the deal to reopen most of the Department of Homeland Security in the wee hours of Friday morning. 42 days into the shutdown that was spurred by the Trump administration's immigration operations in Minnesota. Yes, Chuck Schumer and his Democratic colleagues are fully supporting the crime and the fraud being committed in the state of Minnesota. That tells you something about the Democratic Party, don't you know? It was an agreement that largely gave Schumer and the Senate Democrats what they wanted. No funding for immigration and customs enforcement and parts of custom and border protection. But it lacked the stringent reforms they desired, like requiring judicial warrants or requiring agents to unmask so that they could be hounded. Well, State Department reveals the world's most dangerous countries for Americans. State Departments continue to update its travel advisories as the conflict with Iran and adversarial relationship with other nations continue to play out across the world. Americans traveling abroad can be targets for arbitrary arrest or attacks, according to the agency. In its interactive world map, the agency has branded several Middle Eastern countries as unsafe for Americans to travel to. Saudi Arabia, Oman, Kuwait, and Bahrain have moved from level 2 to level 3 advisories, meaning Americans should exercise caution or reconsider their travels to those locations altogether. That's according to the New York Post. Iran's been branded a level 4 do not travel destination, with Americans facing risk of wrongful detention, violence, and kidnapping and amid the unrest that's going on there. Last week, the State Department issued a worldwide security alert warning Americans to be cautious about the threats from groups linked to Iran. From now on, based on information we have about you, even parks, recreational areas, and tourist destinations anywhere in the world will no longer be safe for you. That's according to Iranian Brigadier General Abu Fazl Shakarchi. He warned Americans and Israelis on Iranian state television. Countries with a level 4 warning, which means do not travel, include Afghanistan, Haiti, Iraq, Libya, Russia, Somalia, Sudan, Ukraine, and Yemen. And unfortunately, it's only going to get worse, I suspect, before it gets any better. Well, a New Jersey middle school teacher has been charged with child sexual assault after an alleged relationship with a student. Former middle school teacher in New Jersey was arrested Thursday after allegations she had had a sexual relationship with a student. Ashley Fizzler, 36, of Washington Township in Gloucester County, was charged with 6 counts of first-degree sexual assault of a minor. one account of second degree endangering the welfare of a child, one account of second degree child official misconduct. That's according to Fox 29. Each first degree charge carries a maximum of 20 years in prison, and each second degree charge carries a maximum of 10 years. The arrest of his former teacher comes after the victim, who's now an adult, reported the details to police earlier this year. This victim was the student in officials' class at the time the sexual relationship began. She allegedly engaged in a sexual relationship with a student in 2021. She was a teacher at Orchard Valley Middle School, according to the outlet. You know, there were rumors of that back when I was in high school. Some thought it was terrible, and others went, "Why not me?" Well, former Eagles star Brent Selleck's ex-wife reveals a relationship with another ex-Philadelphia player. An Eagles love story's taken off in the city of brotherly love. Susie Selleck, ex-wife of Super Bowl champion Brent Selleck, took to social media this week to reveal her relationship with former Eagles player Hollis Thomas. She shared a video of her and Thomas during various outings, highlighting moments of affection. She captioned it, "Life trends show I'm not big on commitment, but I'm stuck on you, big man." Lionel Richie's "Stuck on You" was attached to the post. Well, a teen mob swarmed the downtown area in a chaotic takeover. Fights erupt, cars were targeted before curfew crackdown hits. This was in downtown Chicago, which descended into chaos Wednesday night, prompting a curfew enforcement order and intensifying the debate over how to stop repeat takeovers in the Loop. Activity centered on State and Lake Streets, where witnesses described crowds of young people running through the area, climbing on vehicles, engaging in fights. Alderman Brian Hopkins said conditions escalated quickly before officials intervened. In a post on X, Hopkins said the situation was just totally out of control before a curfew enforcement order was issued about 10 p.m. He said the crowd began to thin out within about 40 minutes, calling the response effective. Chicago police confirmed multiple enforcement actions tied to the gathering, including 8 juvenile arrests and 24 curfew violations. According to police, 7 juveniles, ranges in age from 13 to 16, are each charged with misdemeanor reckless conduct. And one of the teens, a 15-year-old boy, also had an outstanding warrant. Another 16-year-old boy faces more serious charges, including 3 felony counts of aggravated assault of a peace officer and a misdemeanor reckless conduct charge and citation for riding a bicycle on the sidewalk. That is definitely a serious crime, especially in Chicago. Well, let's see. Washington Democrats passed an income tax they know is unconstitutional, and that apparently was the point. Travis Kalanick chose to ditch California December 18th for a reason. The Uber co-founder relocated from San Francisco to Austin, Texas, 14 days before California's would-be billionaire wealth tax residency deadline, dodging a potential $180 million hit on his $3.6 billion fortune. Made no secret about the calculation. He said, "Just to be clear, on December 18th, I moved to Texas." I don't know what's so specific about December 18th, but let's just say it's prior to January. Said in an interview with TPBN. He joined Tesla's CEO Elon Musk, Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg, Google co-founder Larry Page, also Google co-founder Sergey Brin, and PayPal and Founders Fund founder Peter Thiel in a steady procession of wealth abandoning blue states for Florida and Texas. Democrats have been engineering this for years. California, New York, and now Washington State are running the same tax hiking playbook at nearly the same moment, and the results are entirely predictable. The people that made the money, for a selfish reason, want to keep it. Democrats want it so that they can fund out their special social programs. Well, Heather Graham slams awkward new reality of Hollywood sex scenes. She shared mixed feelings about Hollywood's new approach to filming sex scenes. She opened up about working with intimacy coordinators in the wake of the Me Too movement. And that's a new job, an intimacy coordinator. She said, I think the Me Too movement was amazing, and I think it's a very good intention behind intimacy coordinators. But it is odd when you come up without having them, and suddenly there's this random person in the room just staring at you while you're like pretending to have sex, she said, told US Weekly. Kind of awkward. She said, I know they have a beautiful intention. They really want to help and protect actors. But as the actor, sometimes I'm like, can you just get all these people out of the room? I think it would be definitely an awkward situation. Well, President Trump praised the San Francisco mayor for trying very hard to improve the city after moderates took over the leadership. He praised San Francisco Mayor Daniel Lurie during a cabinet meeting Thursday for really trying to improve the city after the moderates took power. He said, I know they have a mayor who's trying hard. He's a Democrat, but he's still trying hard. And we can do it much more effectively, but he can't do what we can do. He can't take people out from the city and bring them back to the country where they came from, where they were in prison. They were allowed to go in prisons. They were drug dealers, highest level of drug dealers, murderers, 11,888 murderers. We do things they can't do. He spoke after Secretary of War Pete Hegseth during a meeting that initially addressed the war in Iran. Conversation then pivoted to Democrat-run cities' handling of illegal immigration and crime. He said, we can get a lot safer than it is. San Francisco, a great city, was a great city. Quickly become a great city again. Well, we'll see if that continues. North Carolina woman who vanished 24 years ago reunites with the daughter outside the courtroom. North Carolina woman who vanished more than 2 decades ago and was found alive earlier this year, tearfully reuniting with her daughter Thursday. Michelle Hudnall Smith appeared in front of a Rockingham County judge in North Carolina Thursday related to a DWI charge from November 2001. After initial appearance, she quickened her pace to tearfully embrace her daughter, Amanda Hundley, outside the courtroom. They hadn't been together since the gray-haired 63-year-old vanished from her husband and 3 children 24 years ago. Hundley Smith said, Amanda, your hair wasn't this length. We walked right by you. I didn't recognize you. Well, Hudnall Smith was located February 20th in an undisclosed location within North Carolina after the detectives received new information about her case. Sheriff Sam Page said Smith told investigators she left her family of her own accord and cited ongoing domestic issues as a reason for her disappearance. He didn't elaborate on those issues, and investigators have said there's no evidence of foul play. She was 38 when she walked out and disappeared after leaving her 3 children at a Eden, North Carolina home December 9, 2001 to go Christmas shopping at Kmart in Martinsville, Virginia. Her vehicle was never found and she didn't return home. Husband reported her missing later that month. Apparently he wasn't rushing to try to find her either. Well, the knives are out for Fetterman as the Democrats turn on the one-time progressive star. Pennsylvania Senator John Fetterman is facing escalating backlash within his own party, with one House Democrat saying this week she has more success working with a Republican senator and another calling for him to step down. Criticism reflects growing friction between Fetterman and his progressive political base as he breaks with Democrats on key issues, including his support for Israel, backing off Homeland Security Secretary Marconi Mullen, and openness to voter ID. Once a darling of the political left who exchanged endorsements with socialist Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, Fetterman now finds himself a target of attacks from his own party. Yes, he's apparently decided the loony left is not the place he wants to be, and the loony left can't stand it. Well, what's known as gas station heroin's been banned in another state amid nationwide crackdowns. A dangerous substance that's been dubbed gas station heroin continues to alarm medical professionals. More states making moves to restrict or ban the tianeptine. 14 states officially classified the tricyclic antidepressant as a Schedule I controlled substance. Connecticut's the latest state to crack down, officially banning the sale and use of the substance starting on Wednesday. Tianeptine, which can produce euphoria in higher doses, can be more potent than morphine and more addictive than opioids, according to the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Some countries have taken steps to restrict how it is prescribed or dispensed, and have even revised the labels to warn people of potentially addictive qualities. I've heard a lot of stories about this drug. Now, let's see. According to Senator Mike Lee, Democrats have an existential crisis. They're trying to work through it. But that's what you get when you let the loony left take over. Well, Long Island woman went missing after jumping from a moving vehicle in a panicked state. She could be in danger. She vanished after suddenly jumping out of a moving vehicle and running off last week. Brittany Critis Garrett, 32, was last seen on surveillance footage in Oyster Bay about 8 p.m. Friday, before she was reported missing. That's according to News 12 Long Island. Her husband, Fernando Garrett, said she was in a panic state, jumped out of a moving car, threw her phone into a bush, and ran off. It was the last time her family saw her. Garrett told that volunteers have searched wooded areas, as well as rural and suburban areas. Nico Caritas told Patch his sister was vulnerable and asked residents check their properties for spaces where somebody could seek shelter or hide. Those small, careful actions could be what brings Brittany back home. We believe she may be trying to isolate or avoid contact, and it's possible she could be sheltering in a secluded or hidden area. I also asked homeowners to check their security cameras. We think she's disoriented and frightened. May think she's in danger, according to search organizer Sarah Castor. She's not dangerous, she just needs help. Well, a judge has let an ex-police officer walk after she denied pointing a gun at a fellow police officer who shot her in a home standoff. Story is discussing suicide. Former Massachusetts police officer been found not guilty of attempting to shoot a brother in blue after she testified she's trying to kill herself as officers arrived at her home to serve a restraining order filed by her ex-fiancé. Kelsey Fitzsimmons, 29-year-old former North Andover police officer, went to trial after she was charged with a single count of assault with a dangerous weapon. After prosecutors alleged she pointed a gun at a fellow officer, Patrick Noonan, and attempted to fire it on June 25th, 2025. But Fitzsimmons vehemently denied the allegations. Instead, she insisted she was attempting to kill herself when officers arrived at her home to serve the restraining order obtained by her fiancé, Justin Elation, and take custody of her young child. She said, "I didn't want to involve anybody. I just wanted to take my own life," she said earlier this week. Never pointed a gun at a fellow officer. Never happened. Verdict was handed down by Judge Jeffrey Karp after nearly 4 hours of deliberations on Thursday. Well, Karp decided the case because Fitzsimmons reportedly waived her right to a trial by jury. Well, the Treasury is going to place President Trump's signature on paper currency to mark the nation's 250th anniversary. U.S. dollar bills are going to bear President Trump's signature to mark the 250th anniversary of American independence. That's a first for a sitting president. His signature is going to be placed on all U.S. paper currency. It's going to replace the Treasury of the United States signature on U.S. money for the first time in 165 years. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said the move is going to recognize the Trump administration's historic achievements. Under Trump's leadership, we're on a path toward unprecedented economic growth, lasting dollar dominance, and fiscal strength and stability, Bessent said in a statement. That's no more powerful way to recognize the historic achievements for our great country and President Trump than the U.S. dollar bills bearing his name. And it's the only appointee, no, it's only appropriate that this historic currency be issued at the sesquicentennial. We'll see how that plays out. Well, TSA officers are losing their homes. They can't pay medical bills and can't afford Easter baskets for their children, according to reports. Transportation Security Administration officers receiving their third paycheck of $0 on Friday with the DHS shutdown. President Trump saying late Thursday he had signed an executive order to immediately pay our TSA agents in order to address this emergency situation and stop the Democratic chaos at the airports. And as the Senate advanced the new last-minute deal in the wee hours of Friday morning, TSA on Thursday afternoon exclusively shared with Fox News stories of officers stationed at various airports around the nation who had experienced personal hardship as a result of the shutdown, with names omitted for privacy reasons, of course. One officer at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport in Georgia had his dream of owning a home abruptly shattered, forcing him to make real life-altering decisions. His bank denied him a loan for a home in Georgia due to his current inability to make rent payments. He now has to move nearly 1,000 miles to go live with family in New York. Well, Chuck Schumer has a lot to answer for. The question is, does anybody have the intestinal fortitude to make him pay? Well, Taylor Swift stunned at the iHeartRadio Music Awards. Jason and Brittany Aldean turned heads during a date night. The music industry's biggest star shone brightly at the 2026 iHeartRadio Music Awards. You know, iHeartRadio carries the Ken Hudnall Show. You might check that out. Celebrities rocked the red carpet at the Dolby Theater Thursday, March 26th, on their way to watch Ludacris host the award show honoring the best of the best in the entertainment. Hollywood power company Donnie Wahlberg and Jenny McCarthy walked the red carpet together. Wahlberg posted photos in a classic black suit with black and white design on the collar. While McCartney opted for a black dress with a low back and thigh-high slit, which she paired with a silver sparkling clutch. Country music royalty Jason Aldean and his wife Brittany posed for photos side by side on the red carpet. Jason sported an all-black look, including a leather jacket and a black cowboy hat. Brittany wore a pink long-sleeve dress with ruffles, which she paired with an updo and a diamond necklace. Yes, while people supporting the country are doing without, the wealthy are flaunting their excess. Well, Josh Duhamel says he's now 70% ready for a zombie apocalypse at his doomsday cabin, but said he actually feared AI robots even more than zombies. Josh Duhamel told Fox News he's now 72% ready for a zombie apocalypse at his off-the-grid doomsday cabin in rural Minnesota, after he joked he was about 70% ready last summer. He said, "Every year I get a little bit more prepared, and that's part of the fun and the journey of figuring it out, seeing what the latest and greatest is. I'm less afraid of zombies, more afraid of AI robots now. I don't know if ever going to fully be able to, but protect yourself from what's coming. But at least I can hopefully turn off all devices and just sort of shut them ourselves off in the world if we need to." Well, it's going to be interesting to see if we have a zombie apocalypse. Well, United Jet dodges a Black Hawk helicopter in a last-second maneuver over California airport. Federal Aviation Administration is investigating after a close call Tuesday night between a United Airlines passenger plane and a Black Hawk helicopter at John Wayne Airport in Santa Ana, California. United Airlines Flight 589 was on its final approach to John Wayne Airport when a Sikorsky Black Hawk helicopter crossed in front of its flight path at about 8:40 p.m. United Airlines spokesperson told Fox News the Boeing 737-800's pilots were advised by air traffic control to watch for a military helicopter flying near the airport. Well, they saw the helicopter and received a traffic alert, which they responded to by leveling the aircraft. The flight then went on to land safely. Well, I flew into John Wayne Airport a lot of times when I lived in California. It's not a place I'd like to have a traffic jam. Well, yesterday, we talked about the UFO hit list. Got a lot of comments. Well, there's a second book in that series. It's called The Marconi Deaths. Radar Secrets and the Wave of Engineered Deaths. You know, stories about unexplained deaths in high technology industries are often dismissed as conspiracy thinking and product of coincidences or overactive imaginations. You know, engineers work under pressure. Deadlines loom. National security projects demand secrecy. Accidents happen. People suffer stress and lives unravel. But that explanation works till the numbers stop behaving like coincidence. Between the late 1980s and early 2000s, an unusually high number of scientists and engineers connected to Marconi Electronic Systems, one of Britain's most important defense contractors, died under circumstances officially classified as accidents or suicides. Individually, each case was closed. Collectively, they formed a pattern that troubled journalists and members of parliament and even some within the defense establishment itself. What makes the Marconi deaths worthy of renewed examination is not simply their quantity, but their context. These weren't unskilled laborers or transient workers. They were carefully vetted specialists engaged in some of the most sensitive electronic surveillance, radar, and tracking programs of the Cold War and its immediate aftermath. A lot of them worked on the systems designed to detect objects that conventional aircraft theory couldn't easily explain. Targets that appeared briefly, behaved unpredictably, and then vanished. We don't claim to know exactly what happened to these engineers or what it was they discovered. We don't argue that every death that was the result of foul play. But what we do argue, based on documented cases, official responses, statistical anomalies, is that the explanations offered by authorities were insufficient and that meaningful questions were left unanswered. The Marconi deaths occupy a strange place between acknowledged defense secrecy and unacknowledged technological anxiety. Sit at the crossroads of classified research, institutional silence, and persistent reluctance to look too closely at uncomfortable facts. Well, this volume exists to document what is known, to assemble the fragments in a coherent narrative, and preserve a record that was too often been dismissed, minimized, or forgotten. Well, now, the Marconi Electronic System was not a peripheral defense contractor operating at the fringes of Britain's military-industrial complex. Quite the contrary, it was central, embedded deeply in radar development, electronic warfare, communications intelligence, and advanced tracking systems during the most anxious decades of the Cold War. Company's lineage dates back to Guglielmo Marconi himself, whose early work in radio communication helped define modern electronic warfare. By the late 20th century, Marconi had become synonymous with cutting-edge defense electronics. Its engineers designed systems capable of identifying, tracking, and classifying aerial objects across vast distances, often under conditions of extreme ambiguity. Now, these were not consumer technologies. They were tools intended to operate at the limits of detection, where signals were weak, data incomplete, and interpretation uncertain. Engineers were trained to expect false positive, anomalous returns, and targets that defied easy categorization. Secrecy wasn't merely policy at Marconi, it was culture. Projects were compartmentalized to such a degree that engineers frequently lacked knowledge of the broader systems they are actually working on. Conversations were restricted, documentation was tightly controlled. Family members often knew little more than their spouses or parents worked in defense. This environment fostered both technical excellence and profound isolation. By the late 1980s, Marconi engineers are increasingly involved in radar and surveillance systems capable of detecting low observable objects, what later decades would call stealth targets. These systems are also tasked with monitoring anomalous radar contacts that didn't conform to known flight profiles. Officially, such anomalies were dismissed as sensor errors or atmospheric effects or foreign test platforms. Unofficially, they presented a problem. Some objects didn't behave like aircraft at all. It was in this atmosphere of intense secrecy and unresolved ambiguity that the first unexplained deaths occurred. At the time, nobody outside a narrow circle noticed. Only later on, when the deaths accumulated, did questions begin to form. The earliest Marconi-associated deaths didn't immediately attract attention. Each incident taken alone appeared tragic, but of course explainable. A fall from a bridge, a single vehicle crash on a quiet road, or drowning with no witnesses. A sudden suicide with no note. Authorities handled each case as routine. Coroners recorded verdict. Police closed files. Families were left to grieve without answers, but with official conclusions. The problem emerged only when journalists and researchers began comparing cases. By the mid-1990s, the number of Marconi engineers dying under unusual circumstances exceeding what would normally be expected in a comparable population. These were individuals selected for psychological stability, technical precision, and reliability. They worked in a high-stress environment, but not one known for disproportionate self-destruction. But researchers found that patterns began to appear. Many deaths involved falls from bridges or elevated structures. Several occurred shortly after career transitions or reassignments. A disproportionate number were ruled suicide despite a lack of prior indicators. And in multiple cases, families contested official conclusions but were ignored. Statistical anomalies are uncomfortable things, of course. There was this simple explanation that demand deeper inquiry. When confronted with such anomalies, institutions often respond not with investigation but with normalization, finding ways to explain away patterns as coincidence. And that's precisely what happened here. Defense officials emphasized stress, overwork, personal problems. They cited the pressures of classified research and the emotional toll of secrecy. These explanations were repeated as so often they became accepted wisdom. But stress alone doesn't explain why deaths clustered around a single corporation engaged in a narrow set of technologies. That doesn't explain why similar rates were not observed across the broader defense industry. At some point, coincidence stops behaving like coincidence. Starts becoming something else, don't you know? When concerns about the Marconi deaths finally reached public awareness, the response from authorities was swift and uniform. There was no cover-up, they said, no connection between cases, no evidence of wrongdoing. Officials insisted that each death had been independently investigated and properly classified. And that narrative rested on three strong pillars. Stress. Engineers worked long hours under intense pressure. Burnout was inevitable. Mental health. Suicide, officials argued, can strike without warning. An accident. Falls and crashes do happen. Tragedy doesn't require explanation beyond misfortune. Well, these explanations are plausible until you examine them closely. In multiple cases, families reported their loved ones showed no signs of depression. Some were planning vacations, others had recently celebrated professional milestones. A few had explicitly expressed optimism about the future. Coroner's inquests were often brief. Police investigations were minimal. Classified employment histories limited public scrutiny. In several instances, records were sealed or difficult to obtain. Members of Parliament began asking questions, not loudly, of course, but persistently. Why were there so many deaths? Why so many similarities? Why so little transparency? And the answers they received in most cases were actually non-answers. Officials acknowledged the deaths but denied connection. They emphasized that defense work was demanding, that engineers, like anybody else, were vulnerable to personal crisis, and no further inquiry was warranted, and that officials believed should have ended the story. Instead, it marked the point at which the silence became the most suspicious response of all. When officials and corporate representatives were eventually pressed to explain the growing number of deaths connected to Marconi electronic systems, they relied heavily on a familiar and largely unchallengeable explanation. Stress, don't you know? Defense work, they said, was inherently demanding. Engineers labored under intense deadlines. Secrecy created isolation. Burnout was inevitable. Well, at first glance, these arguments appeared reasonable. Marconi engineers did work long hours. A lot of projects were classified. The inability to discuss work openly with family or friends placed emotional strain on employees. In some cases, stress undoubtedly played a role in declining health or quality of life. But at the end of the day, stress is not a diagnosis. It's a catch-all justification, often invoked when deeper inquiry is inconvenient. What distinguished the Marconi explanation is how stress was applied after the fact, not as a documented condition, but as a narrative overlay. In many cases, there's no evidence that the deceased had sought psychological help, exhibited erratic behavior, or reported overwhelming pressure. But stress was cited anyway, because it couldn't be disproven. Families who question this explanation are often told the stress can be hidden. Individuals sometimes mask distress, and suicide or accidents can occur without warning. While this is true in isolated cases, it becomes far less convincing when applied repeatedly to a specific population. If stress alone accounted for the deaths, similar patterns would be expected elsewhere. Other defense contractors operated under comparable conditions. Universities conducted classified research. Aerospace and nuclear industries imposed similar secrecy and pressure. But no comparable cluster of unexplained fatalities emerged in these settings. Stress can explain an event, but it can't explain a distribution. Repeated invocation of stress served an important institutional purpose. It framed the deaths as personal tragedies rather than organizational and systemic concerns. It redirected attention away from workplace conditions, project content, and security pressures, and it allowed inquiries to be closed without further examination. In this sense, stress became not an explanation but a mechanism for closure. One of the most troubling aspects of the Marconi deaths is the frequency in which fatalities were ruled suicides, often in the absence of traditional warning signs. Suicide investigations typically look for indicators: documented mental health struggles, prior attempts, substance abuse, withdrawal, expressions of despair, or significant behavioral changes. In many Marconi cases, these indicators are either absent, undocumented, or contested by families. A striking number of the deaths involved falls from bridges or elevated structures, single vehicle crashes with no witnesses, or drownings under ambiguous conditions. And these methods, while not unheard of, share a common feature: limited forensic reconstruction. They reduce opportunities to determine intent conclusively and allow for rapid declassification. In several instances, family members publicly or privately challenged suicide determinations. They described loved ones who were meticulous and future-oriented and professionally engaged. Some had recently planned vacations, accepted promotions, or discussed long-term goals. These objections rarely altered official findings. Inquests are often brief, classified employment, restricted access to relevant information. Questions about workplace pressures or project involvement were deemed irrelevant to the cause of death. Engineers working on sensitive defense projects are not randomly selected from the population. They undergo extensive vetting for psychological stability and reliability. While this doesn't make them immune to mental illness, it does make clusters of unexplained suicides statistically improbable. The issue is not whether suicide occurred in any individual case. It's whether suicide was too readily accepted as an explanation across a lot of the cases without sufficient scrutiny. Well, Marconi engineers occupied a unique professional position. They worked at the cutting edge of radar, electronic warfare, and signal analysis, fields where the unknown was not theoretical but operational. Radar engineers routinely encounter false positives, interference, and noise, and their task is to filter, classify, and explain. But occasionally, systems detect objects or behaviors that don't conform to known categories. These anomalies present a professional dilemma. They have to be resolved, ignored, or quietly contextualized. For engineers working on advanced detection systems, repeated anomalous data can create tension between empirical observation and acceptable explanation. Marconi's security structure ensured the engineers rarely saw the full scope of the systems they supported. Compartmentalization limited knowledge sharing. Discussing concerns outside approved channels was prohibited. Even within the company, raising persistent questions could mark an individual as a problem. This environment fostered professional isolation. Engineers encountering unresolved anomalies often had no forum for open discussion. Silence was not merely encouraged, it was enforced. Popular literature often frames such situations as cases for individuals knowing too much. more accurate descriptions that some engineers knew enough to recognize inconsistencies from what the system detected and what institutions were prepared to acknowledge. And whether this knowledge placed individuals at risk is impossible to prove, but it places their deaths in a context that demands examination rather than just outright dismissal. Eventually, the accumulation of deaths prompted concern beyond families and journalists. Even members of the British Parliament raised questions, measured, procedural, and cautious. Among the questions they asked, how many Marconi employees had died under unusual circumstances, and whether any of the deaths were connected, and whether workplace conditions had been reviewed, and whether additional oversight was warranted. Well, officials acknowledged the deaths were, but denied any connection. Each case, they said, had been independently investigated. No evidence of systemic issues was discovered, and no further inquiry was justified. This response was notable not for its defensiveness, but for its finality. No comprehensive external investigation was commissioned. No independent audit of workplace practices was ever conducted. Classified considerations were cited as barriers to transparency, effectively placing large portions of relevant information beyond scrutiny. Parliamentary questions dwindled. Media attention faded. The issue was closed not through resolution, but through attrition. In democratic systems, unresolved questions usually generate further inquiry. In this particular case, they generated silence. The absence of answers became normal. The deaths receded from public consciousness. Institutional silence in this context functions as a conclusion. The Marconi deaths didn't unfold entirely in the shadows, though. For a brief period, they attracted genuine media attention. British newspapers, trade journals, and independent reporters noted a growing number of unexplained fatalities among scientists and engineers connected to one of the nation's most important defense contractors. Now, this reporting was cautious but unmistakable in its concern. Early articles focused on numbers and patterns. Reporters compiled lists of deaths, noting similarities in circumstances and causes. Headlines avoided sensational language, instead framing the issue as a statistical oddity that warranted explanation. Several pieces referenced questions raised in Parliament, lending the story a measure of institutional legitimacy. What distinguished this coverage was its restraint. Journalists didn't accuse Marconi of wrongdoing. They did not speculate about espionage or sabotage. They simply asked whether coincidence alone could account for the pattern. Then the coverage slowed. Investigative journalism thrives on continuity. A story that raises unanswered questions is normally revisited and expanded and contextualized. In the Marconi case, though, that process stalled. Follow-up articles became rare. Planned series never materialized. Broadcast investigations failed to appear. In some instances, earlier reports became difficult to locate in later archives. In others, they remained accessible but were never cited again. The story faded without resolution. This disappearance isn't unique to Marconi. Cases involving national security often encounter subtle barriers. Editors wary of legal exposure, sources unwilling to speak further, and institutions invoking confidentiality. Over time, the cost of persistence outweighs the perceived benefit. The result's not censorship in a traditional sense, rather it's attrition. Journalists attempting to pursue the Marconi story faced predictable obstacles. Classified employment histories limited what could be verified. Official statements provided little substance. Families were reluctant to relive the trauma. Without new information, the editors moved on. What remains striking is not that media failed to solve the mystery, but that it abandoned it entirely. No authoritative investigation replaced the initial reporting. No official review answered the questions that had been raised. And the silence that followed was not the product of resolution, it was the product of exhaustion. To assess whether the Marconi deaths were truly anomalous, it's necessary to examine comparable industries. Defense research is not unique in its demands. Scientists and engineers across multiple sectors work under pressure, secrecy, and high stakes. If stress and overwork was sufficient explanation, similar patterns would be visible elsewhere. But research showed they were not. Other major defense contractors employed thousands of engineers working on missile guidance, nuclear deterrence, cryptography, and aerospace systems. Universities partnered with governments on classified research. Intelligence agencies relied on civilian technical expertise. None of these environments produced a comparable cluster of unexplained deaths concentrated within a specific technical domain. Now, this isn't to suggest that tragedies didn't occur elsewhere. Accidents and illnesses and suicides happen in large organizations. What distinguishes the Marconi case is density and similarity. Multiple deaths over a limited time frame among individuals working on closely related technologies. Large organizations experience predictable mortality rates. Actuarial models account for age, profession, and health factors. Deviations occur, but they rarely cluster so narrowly. In the Marconi case, the deaths were not evenly distributed across departments or roles. They appeared disproportionately among engineers involved in advanced electronic systems, particularly radar and detection technologies. This uneven distribution undermines explanations based solely on workplace stress or demographic coincidence. Comparative analysis doesn't prove causation. It does, though, establish context. When an organization deviates significantly from industry norms, the deviation itself becomes a fact requiring explanation. The failure to conduct such comparative analysis at the institutional level represents a missed opportunity for clarity. Instead, the Marconi deaths were treated as isolated events, each stripped of its relationship to the others. Well, any serious examination of the Marconi deaths has to confront the nature of the work its engineers perform. And Marconi specialized in radar, electronic warfare, and advanced signal processing, fields defined by their engagement with uncertainty. Radar systems don't present clear pictures of the world. They present data, returns, echoes, tracks, probabilities. Engineers are trained to distinguish signal from noise, to filter interference, and to classify contacts based on behavior rather than appearance. Most anomalies are mundane. Weather effects, equipment glitches, and atmospheric conditions produce false returns. Now, these are expected and usually resolved, but not all anomalies disappeared. As detection systems became more sensitive, they began to register objects that behaved in ways existing models could not easily explain. These objects appeared briefly, moved unpredictably, or vanished without trace. Official doctrine attributed these events to benign causes, even when explanations are incomplete. For engineers, this created professional tension. Their job was to improve detection accuracy, yet some detections resisted classification. Repeated anomalies challenged assumptions built on the systems themselves. Acknowledging these challenges openly was difficult. Defense institutions rely on confidence in technology and doctrine and capability. Admitting persistent unknowns undermines that confidence. Discussions of unidentified aerial phenomena is often dismissed as speculative. In this context, it's better understood as a data problem, not a belief system. Engineers didn't need to believe in extraterrestrial craft to recognize that some radar contacts defy conventional explanation. The relevance to the Marconi deaths lies not in what the objects were, but in what the engineers were expected to do with the data. Ignore it, maybe reinterpret it, or quietly note its existence without resolution. Now, this environment, where empirical observation conflicts with acceptable explanation, creates strain that's difficult to quantify and impossible to discuss openly. And the presence of unresolved anomalies doesn't explain the Marconi deaths. It does, though, situated within a professional context defined by secrecy and uncertainty and institutional pressure to maintain coherence. Engineers working at the limits of detection inhabit a world where not everything can be explained, where acknowledging that fact carried professional risk. If the deaths associated with the Marconi electronic system were not random, the next question becomes unavoidable. What is it that's being protected? This question is often misunderstood as an accusation that somebody knew a specific secret and was silent to prevent disclosure. The reality may be much more complex and less dramatic, but no less consequential. Marconi's work sat at the heart of Britain's air defense and electronic warfare capability. Radar systems, signal processing algorithms, and electronic countermeasures represented enormous strategic value. Even incremental advances could shift military balance, rendering adversary platforms obsolete or vulnerable. Such an environment, containment of uncertainty, becomes as important as protection of information. Admitting that systems encounter persistent, unexplained anomalies risk undermining confidence in doctrine and procurement and national defense narratives. Beyond technology itself, institutions have reputations to protect. Defense establishments rely on the perception of mastery over airspace, over detection, over threat assessment. Persistent anomalies challenge that perception. From this perspective, silence is not concealment of truth, but it's management of ambiguity. Problems that can't be resolved or minimized, reframed, or quietly absorbed into classified compartments where they no longer demand public explanation. Engineers working within this system occupy an uncomfortable middle ground. They're trained to observe, to measure, to refine, but they're constrained by doctrines that may not fully account for what their instruments reveal. This doesn't require malice or conspiracy. It requires only a system in which acknowledging unresolved problems carries professional risk, while silence carries none. Marconi case doesn't require the existence of a hidden hand or orchestrated campaign. It requires only a set of incentives that favor closure over inquiry, explanation over uncertainty, silence over discomfort. What may have been protected ultimately was not a secret, but a boundary. The boundary between what institutions can explain and what they prefer not to acknowledge. Well, the Marconi deaths didn't end with a dramatic revelation or an official reckoning. Instead, they faded, slowly, quietly, into the background of unresolved history. Time passed. Marconi emerged, rebranded, dissolved into successor entities. Engineers retired, records aged as deaths ceased to accumulate at the same pace. For institutions, this slowing functioned as closure. But patterns do not require continuation to remain patterns. Independent researchers periodically revisited the data. Lists were updated. Statistical analysis were repeated. Each review arrived at the same conclusion. Coincidence could explain some cases, but not all of them. Distribution remained anomalous. The similarities persisted. What changed was not the evidence, but the attention. Marconi deaths matter not because they prove wrongdoing, but because they illustrate how modern institutions handle unresolved data. They show how inquiry can be deflected without answers, how silence can substitute for explanation, how human cost can be absorbed into administrative closure. This isn't an argument for conspiracy, it's an argument for memory. We don't claim to solve the Marconi case, but we do claim something more modest and more defensible. To preserve the record, to assemble the fragments, and to resist the temptation for premature certainty. Some questions remain unanswered because they were never fully asked. Others remain unanswered because the answers were inconvenient. The Marconi deaths belong to that unresolved space and deserve to remain there, examined rather than dismissed. Now, there were a number of representative cases that we came up on. These cases are presented as representative profiles based on publicly reported information. They're not exhaustive, nor did they assert causation. Now, a lot of the names were redacted to preserve privacy. The first case filed involved a senior radar systems engineer. He'd been over a decade with Marconi, found deceased after a fall from a bridge. Official ruling almost immediately was suicide. Colleagues described the engineer as methodical and reserved. No documented history of mental illness. Family members reported no signs of distress or suicidal ideation. So there's a number of unresolved questions. Why was suicide concluded without evidence or prior instability? Were workplace pressures or project involvement examined? Why are investigative records minimal? The second case involved an electronics specialist. He worked in signal processing. Single vehicle accident on a rural road. Official ruling, accident. Context: the crash occurred under clear conditions with no witnesses. No mechanical failure is publicly identified. Among the questions asked about this case, why were toxicology and mechanical reports limited? Why was no further reconstruction conducted? In other words, it was just pushed to the side and ignored. The third case involved a senior software engineer in defense systems. His role was embedded software for detection platforms. He drowned, immediately ruled an accident. Friends described the individual as cautious and risk adverse. Location was not known for hazardous conditions. Among the questions about this case, were environmental factors adequately assessed? Why was the death classified so quickly without any further investigation? Well, the next case file involves a systems integration engineer. His role was integration of radar subsystems. Fell from a height. Immediate ruling, suicide. Been recently reassigned to a new project. There's no suicide note. The family challenged the ruling. Among the questions that were unresolved was reassignment considered a stressor? And why were the family objections dismissed so quickly? Well, the next case involved a defense electronics consultant. His role was advisory work across multiple Marconi projects. Sudden death following a reported workplace tension. Official ruling, natural causes. The death occurred shortly after involvement in a high-profile technical review. Among the unresolved questions in this case was occupational stress evaluated medically. And why was the timing not examined? Like they wanted to get it closed as soon as they possibly could. The next case involved a junior engineer very early in his career. Support role in radar testing. He died in a vehicle collision. Official ruling, accident. The context of this case, it was a recent hire, no prior safety incidents. Among the questions, why was this case included in the early list of concern? What commonalities linked it to senior staff fatalities? Well, if you wonder why these cases matter, individually each case appears explainable. Collectively, they form a pattern marked by similar methods, rapid closure, minimal inquiry, and institutional silence. The purpose of these case files is not to assign blame, but to restore context, show how patterns emerge not from any single event, but from accumulation. Well, on that note, we come to the end of today's show. We've run out of time. We're going to talk about From Marconi to America on Monday. But until then, this is Ken Hudnall for the Ken Hudnall Show saying have a truly great weekend.